Speaking of Russia, Moscow says its relationship with the U.S. is the worst that it's been since the Cold War. And President Vladimir Putin has asked the United Nations to investigate the Syrian attack. Russia has denied that Syria was behind the chemical weapons attack and claims to have evidence that the United States is planning further strikes in Syria. That's what the Hill piece was getting into, this headline I just mentioned. Meanwhile, the Washington Free Beacon reports today that Russia is playing a major role in covering up its involvement. Let's talk about this with our next guest, Alexander Vershbow, former NATO Deputy Secretary General and U.S. Ambassador to both NATO and Russia. Welcome, Alexander. It's so good to have you. With all of this out there, do you think that there's a way for the White House and the Kremlin to get on the same page?
Well, it looks pretty difficult to get on the same page. Putin is doubling down by basically pretending that his client did not carry out these chemical attacks. And there may be evidence, I don't know whether that's real, that they're covering up the evidence. But we have to stand our ground. Using chemical weapons is one of the fundamental norms that the Russian client Assad has breached.
Right.
And I think the president did the right thing in launching the airstrikes last week.
And one thing that I want to, and maybe because I don't understand where some of the Russian troops go in Syria and where they're stationed and what resources that they use. But one thing that stood out to me with the reporting from last week is it all began with that deconfliction line, where it was the United States warned Russian troops get out of the way because they were going to go after this one particular airfield, and apparently there were Russian soldiers that had equipment there, or they were there themselves. Is that enough to suggest that there's some sort of involvement, or is it just maybe that particular airfield is so? Because I know it's one of the largest in Syria. Is it just because it can be used for many purposes, or because it strikes me as odd that they would be at a place that originated the chemical attack? Does that sort of at least put enough to pose that question?
Well, the fact that they were at the base that launched the chemical attack does certainly raise questions. But I think what the president decided to do in terms of giving them a heads up so that there wouldn't be any Russian casualties was a sensible thing to do. I mean, he was trying to send the message, this is a limited strike, mainly aimed at punishing Assad for using chemical weapons. It was not the start of a wider campaign to bring down the regime or to punish the regime on a sustained basis. And unfortunately, the Russians are all over Syria.
Right.
I mean, when they come in, they're not just sort of waiting in the wings to help out when needed. They've basically taken over the whole campaign. So they are at just about every key military base that the Syrians have. So in that sense, it's not surprising. But how could they not know that the chemical weapons were being loaded on that plane? That's the question.
Rex Tillerson issued an ultimatum during the G7 discussions with a number of generals, saying that, or with a number of top diplomats, saying that Russia needs to choose a side, either choose Bashar al-Assad or choose the United States. How do you think Russia will react to that ultimatum?
Well, they don't seem to be taking it too well thus far. They're sticking with Assad. They don't, I think, yet see any reason to reduce their support for him. I mean, he has been, their accomplice in reestablishing Russian influence in the Middle East, along with Iran. Their idea is not to defeat ISIS, but it's to prop up their client and use that as a base for expanding their influence in the Middle East. ISIS may get caught in the crossfire, but that's not their number one target. So the question is, how do we generate more leverage to convince the Russians that they have to make this choice? Because it's true, the war will never end if Assad is still there. I mean, the other parties to the conflict, including the moderate opposition that we'd like to sustain, will never sign a peace agreement in which Assad remains as the leader of Syria. So there has to be some kind of easing him out. Maybe step by step, it may not happen all at once. But the Russians don't care if the war grinds on. That's the problem.
Exactly. And then who do you replace Assad with? Because, it's been said, too, if it's not from that Alawite community, then you could be looking at another genocide with that particular group of individuals. And if it's not somebody strong enough, at least to be able to hold on to the reins of power, you're looking at one of the terror factions that's going to be able to take control.
Well, clearly you don't want the terror factions taking over, but there'll have to be some kind of political process. The idea is have a transitional administration for, 6 months, a year, and then organize elections, and hopefully some responsible, moderate political figures will emerge who can help put Syria back together again, probably as a very loose federal state. You're never going to have a unitary Syria ever again, particularly when the Sunnis are in the majority and they've been ruled brutally by an Alawite regime.
Right.
But of course, it all sounds very theoretical right now because the war shows no sign of ending, and the Russians aren't shedding too many tears about that.
Exactly. No sign of stopping. Alexander Vershbow, thank you very much. Appreciate you being on.